Hello YouTube, this is Morgan, Airspeed Prime here at my next Avatar Weekly Discussion topic video. This one is going to be all about the topic of, in the comics right now, is Suki and Zuko, is that a relationship that they're actually setting up? Is it just fans thinking too much into it, or what? That's going to be the video, me analysing their scenes together from the comics to see is there anything to it. But I'll start as ever by just saying that if you want to kind of help support my channel and also through that get involved more with these videos, you can do that by supporting me on Patreon. Depending on what tier you support at, you can either choose completely what the weekly discussion topic is going to be for 1 week. You can even, depending on your tier, decide to be on one of the discussions with me, and we'd record that over Skype, and that would be the video, me discussing your topic with you. That would be cool. And then also, you know, if you're not really into the Avatar stuff, you can choose for like me to discuss a TV show with you online or something like that. So yeah, just check out my Patreon page and you can see the different types of videos that you can kind of ask for me to do depending on what tier you support at. But yeah, let's get into the video. So what I'm going to do here is basically go through nearly all of Suki and Zuko's scenes together in the comics up to now, and really get into, are they actually hinting at a relationship between the two or not? I think before we even get into that, it is important to note that Sokka and Suki are still a couple as of right now currently in the comics. Yes, they haven't had a lot of on-screen time together, but we have had, obviously, the free comic Shells, which completely focused on their relationship. The End of the Promise, as I'll discuss in a minute, completely focuses, on putting Sokka and Suki, together towards the end. And The End of Smoke and Shadow, obviously, is very much hinting at Mai and Zuko potentially getting back together. I think those are the more important things and the things that the series is more hinting at right now, as opposed to this relationship that prior to the comics has no obvious setup really. So for this, we actually start in The Promise. The only real books that cover this in any sort of depth really are The Promise and then Smoke and Shadow, because obviously the Rift is so Toph focused that I don't think Suki's even in it, and then the Search is so focused on like Ursa and Azula that Suki's not really in it either. So it's only really the first and the fourth series of the comics that we need to talk about here: Smoke and Shadow and The Promise. So in The Promise Part 2 is where we have the first kind of proper scene really between them. Obviously, it's at this stage that Mai basically introduces that the Kyoshi warriors are here to help protect Zuko and act as his bodyguards. That's the plot setup of why Suki is even in the Fire Nation. The Kyoshi warriors, at least a little group of them, is there to act as personal bodyguards for Zuko as the Fire Lord. Obviously Zuko and Mai, break up because of the whole issue surrounding Zuko going to visit his father in The Promise. And the reason, obviously, this kind of comes to light is basically because Suki actually notices that that's what Zuko is doing. He keeps kind of disappearing, and she actually eventually one day notices that he's going to the prison to kind of mention that. And then, obviously, at the end of The Promise Part 2, we get the scene where the breakup actually happens. And when Mai leaves, Suki kind of comes in and says, "This is my fault, I'm so sorry. When I asked her to talk to you about your father, that wasn't quite what I had in mind." And Zuko says, "Suki, but how did you?" And she says, "I followed you yesterday morning, sorry about that. We just wanted to know what was going on, to see if we could help in some way. The Kyoshi warriors are really worried about you, Zuko. I'm really worried about you." Now, this is the first time where this ship, I think, really became a thing. The way the panel is drawn, she goes from saying, "We, the Kyoshi warriors, are worried about you," to "I'm worried about you." And it looks like she's reaching out to touch his hand, and the scene kind of transitions away at that point. It's kind of like interrupted. Now, there's obviously two ways to interpret this. One, setting up a romance. I don't think it's the case because, obviously, she is dating Sokka at this point. I think it's just, and I'll say this probably a lot over the course of this video, within Team Avatar, Suki and Zuko is one of the least developed relationships within that group. They've only really had a tiny amount of screen time together, and it's interesting because they're roughly similar ages, in that, Suki, Sokka, Zuko would be the older members of Team Avatar, whereas Katara, Aang, and Toph would be the younger members. So it makes sense that they'd begin to set up the kind of more mature members kind of as being a little bit closer together, be able to talk a little bit more about these kind of deep topics. So I'll reference that a little bit more later, but I think that's what's going on here. It's just that Suki and Zuko are friends. She is his bodyguard, and she's noticing, being so close to him as his kind of personal bodyguard, that he's going through a lot right now, struggling with the leadership, going to visit his father, who she has to know has big problems with, obviously the scar. We assume she got told that story. And just the fact that he's just broken up with his girlfriend and is visiting his father, she is worried about him. It doesn't have to be this romantic thing, like, I'm worried about you, but I want to get with you in a relationship. Like, I don't think that's the interpretation we're meant to have of that scene. After that, it's The Promise Part 3 when we really get to see any sort of stuff with Suki again. And again, this is what happens. Obviously, most of Part 2 has Sokka training with Toph and the whole metal bending plot. But then, at the start of Part 3, Suki arrives via airship and kind of reunites with Toph and Sokka. And immediately we get Sokka and Suki kissing and hugging and stuff like that, and they're very much in a relationship because they're setting that up here. They put this group together, the airship team from the Avatar finale, together as part of the kind of group here to kind of stop this kind of conflict between Kuwei, Zuko, and everyone else kind of coming to a huge issue. And that's really it. We just have that. They're involved in the fight. It goes well. The promise resolves itself, and there's no real kind of reference to kind of what's going on with Zuko and Suki. They just are there, and I think it's very telling that you've had that scene, and the immediate next scene that Suki is in any way is showing her relationship with Sokka. And then, if I remember correctly, Shells would have come out, I think, in or around the time of The Search. So you have another comic there that directly shows their relationship and how close they are and how good they are as a couple. All the while, no further setup for Zuko and Suki being in a relationship. And then, as I said, they're not really in the rift. And then it's basically left for Smoke and Shadow to kind of catch up with them again. And there's a few scenes here that these are the ones that have probably been interpreted the most in terms of like, oh, they're setting something up here. So near the start of Smoke and Shadow Part 1, we get this scene where Zuko kind of has, arrived back, the submarine comes up, and it's basically, the plan for them arriving back in the Fire Nation. It's going to be a dangerous thing because they know there's kind of people against him. And so Suki has organized this situation where Iroh will act as Zuko's decoy, and he will go in the big parade, and then Zuko will be kind of snuck into the capital, kind of undercover, basically. And Zuko, when he sees Suki, helps her down from the kind of the transfer from the submarine to his ship, and says, Suki, thank you for taking care of this. And she says, no problem, Zuko. The messenger hawk got back to us just a few hours ago, so we really had to hustle, but we're prepared to follow your plan down to the last detail. And to just talk about Iroh then. And then we get this scene towards the bottom of the next page, and they're, again, walking onto the submarine because that's how Zuko is going to get into the capital, undercover in the submarine. And she says, we should get going. And then Ki, walking beside Zuko, says, she's pretty, don't you think, Zuko? Referring to Suki. And Zuko just says, sure. And people have been interpreting this one as like crazy. Like, what is this? This clearly shows that Zuko likes Suki. And it's one of those things where, like, a little kid has just asked you about one of your friends. Do you think one of your close friends is pretty and she happens to be a girl? What is Zuko meant to say? If he says no, he's going to insult Suki. And the way he says it, just saying sure, is just like, okay, fine. He is aware that Suki is quite attractive, but it's not him saying like, oh yeah, she's like amazing, she's super hot or anything like that. It's not this crazy thing that like Zuko is suddenly obsessed with Suki. He's just answering Ki's question honestly and to not insult Suki, who is literally like a meter in front of him. So I don't think there's much to that scene. You can obviously question like, why was it even written in the first place? Definitely, but I don't think there's much to it. I think it's just meant to show this brother-sister relationship that Zuko and Ki have, that she says these things when she's around Zuko. There's another scene in Smoke and Shadow Part 1, more towards the end this time out, and basically Zuko is thanking Suki for her help after the whole incident with the attack by the New Ozai Society and stuff like that. They sort it all out, they get back safely, and Zuko just says, "Thank you for your service, Kyoshi warriors. My family and I are in your debt." And Suki, as the leader, says, "It's an honor, Fire Lord." And she says he asks Suki then personally, he says, "Hey Suki, May didn't come back with you, did she?" And she says, "Nope, she went home." And he says, "But do you know where home is for her these days?" And she then says, "Of course, and if you're ever up for a visit, let me know." And the big thing that people took from this was obviously that during these last two panels, Zuko is kind of blushing. And people have interpreted the whole idea of blushing after Suki says, "Come for a visit." And it's very easy, I think, to interpret that. Even I, when I first read this, I obviously got a preview copy, so I had read this without anyone else's opinion on it. So it was just me quickly reading through the book, having no one else to bounce any of my ideas off. I even interpreted this as like, whoa, are they going for Suki Zuko? But then I actually, like, just prior to writing my, like, proper review, read it again more clearly and was just like, oh wait, I completely misinterpreted this. The important thing here is that they're talking about May. So Zuko asks, "May didn't come back with you, did she?" And he asks her, where is May living these days? Because he knows she's not living in her usual house, because as we as readers know, she's living with her aunt Mura. So he wouldn't really know where that is, and he's kind of wondering, where is she? Where does she actually live? And Suki is basically just saying, you know, of course I know where May lives, and if you're ever up for visiting May, let me know. That, like, if you are ever kind of up for trying to restart that relationship, come to me, I will tell you where she lives and try and, you know, help with the process of you two getting back together. And Zuko is blushing at the thought of that relationship again. He's blushing at the thought of kind of meeting with May again and kind of starting that again. That's what's happening here, because again, referencing back to the Promise Part 1 or 2, I can't remember at this point, basically Suki to some extent blames herself for why May and Zuko broke up in the first place. We as readers know that, you know, there was more to it there. You know, Zuko was keeping stuff from her, but I think Suki does kind of feel bad that it was her telling May about Zuko going to visit Ozai that basically caused the issue that led to their breakup. So her trying to some extent help with them getting back together makes complete sense for her, and I really appreciate that. So that's Smoke and Shadow Part 1. And then the only other notable scene, I think the only other scene with Suki and Zuko, is in Smoke and Shadow Part 2. Again, towards the end, this is just prior to Ki being kidnapped by the Kimura Kage. And Zuko's out in the balcony, and Suki comes to speak with him and says, "The Kyoshi warriors just finished up their nightly rounds. Everything's secure." And Zuko says, "Thank you, Suki." She says, "Want some company?" And he says, "Sure." And she says, "You'll find Tom Tom, I know you will." And Zuko says, "Yeah, but it isn't just about finding him. A couple of months before we broke up, May and I took Tom Tom on a picnic with us. I think his mom had errands to run. I don't really remember. At first I was kind of annoyed. I was hoping to get some alone time, just me and May, you know. But then I remember watching him run after this glow moth. He was so happy. I don't remember ever being that happy. May ever tell you what happened to Tom Tom in Omashu?" Suki says, "Yeah." And Zuko says, "So you know, for a little guy, he's been through a lot, but he could still get so much joy from chasing a flying bug. When we find him, will he still be the same kid? Will he ever be that happy ever again?" And then this is interrupted by them noticing that there's smoke coming out of basically the room where Kiki is, and that she's basically been kidnapped. And again, people have been interpreting this as like some sort of romantic thing. But again, look at the Suki's dialogue in this scene. She just comes in, like, doing her job, says, we've done our nightly rounds, everything's secure. Want to talk, basically, want some company. And she just confirms, we will find Tom Tom, because that's what Zuko's worried about. And after that, she just says the word yeah. This scene is basically Zuko talking about his good memories from his relationship with May, and talking about how he actually really likes having Tom Tom around. Very little of this scene is really about Zuko's relationship with Suki. I think the only thing this scene really gets across in relation to Zuko's relationship with Suki is just that he feels comfortable enough around Suki to talk to her about his feelings and stuff like this. And as I said before, this is, I think, just because he feels more comfortable around the likes of Sokka and Suki talking about his kind of relationship stuff than he does around Aang. And even though Aang and Zuko are basically best friends, they are, just separated by age enough that they're not quite, at least right now, on the same maturity level. That Aang and Katara's relationship at this point in time is so good, so like amazing and great, and he's never had any problems with that relationship, really. Aang isn't really the best person to talk to about kind of relationship issues because he's never had any, and the type of character that he is, he's not, I suppose, the most suited to be giving relationship advice to Zuko. So it's very understandable why, like, during Sokka and Zuko's field trip, they talk about romance stuff. Like Sokka mentions the whole idea of what happened with Yue and stuff like that. Zuko, and you have the moment where Zuko nearly walks in on basically Sokka and Suki's kind of love session that was going on there, that funny scene from Avatar. And then this book is more highlighting Zuko's direct relationship with Suki and what that friendship is like. And it's this interesting dynamic that's going on here of where Suki, as her job right now, is to guard Zuko because he has an important role within the world, the Fire Lord, but she's also trying to be his friend as well and kind of be someone he can speak to while he's not with May, and while he needs someone to kind of speak to this stuff about, who is not a member of his family or something like that, someone who is just a kind of outsider, a friend who he can talk to about this stuff. And I think that's where Suki comes in. It just highlights that Suki and Zuko have a very good friendship that was never developed a massive amount within Avatar: The Last Airbender. So it is a kind of new thing for the comics for us to see what their friendship is actually like. Am I saying that 100% there is no way Zuko and Suki could end up together? Not really. I think there's definitely a chance it could happen. I just don't feel that the scenes that we have from the comics right now in any way really hint that that's the direction that they're taking. I think there's, as I said, a chance it could be, like Izumi's mother is Suki, definitely, and they could retroactively turn some of these scenes into kind of more romance setup. But again, you have to go back to like what's actually going on in the story. The way Smoke and Shadow ends, they much more hint that May and Zuko are probably going to get back together. The amount of scenes that those two had together compared to the number of scenes that Zuko and Suki had together, it's insane how big the difference is. Even like some of the final scenes in Smoke and Shadow Part 3 are very much hinting at May and Zuko getting back together. Her breakup with Kalo, all the little scenes of just Zuko and May kind of looking at each other and being very happy. The fact that like we end with this kind of duality moment of the fact that they've both got their little brother, little sister back and are kind of bonding over that fact. It just makes, for me, complete sense that that's the direction they're taking, rather than this kind of almost random relationship that doesn't have a ton of setup of Zuko and Suki. So yeah, again, like the reason I was doing this topic is because almost more than anything about the comics, the question I keep getting asked is, what do you think they're doing with Zuko and Suki? Do you think that's a relationship that they're going for? And I'm just, and in addition to that, do you think they're going to stick with Sokka and Suki as a relationship? And I'm just constantly amazed by like the amount of people who like really heavily believe that the comics are like setting up Suki and Zuko, and I really don't think that's the case. I think, yes, absolutely, at some point they probably should have Suki basically say, okay, I've been your guard for now, you're finally properly, in place as Fire Lord for a while, you're stable, you don't need me here anymore, I'm going to go back to doing my duty, but before that I'm going to go on a break with like Sokka and just have time together. I think that at some point needs to happen just to completely solidify their relationship, but I would put a lot of that as problems down to like Mike and Brian not telling us stuff about like the Avatar crew's, ATLA crew's kind of older lives, basically. Like I'm really surprised that we just don't know so much about like who had kids, who didn't have kids, who a character's wife or husband is. Like there's so many little bits like that we just don't know about these characters, and it is frustrating. It absolutely is frustrating. But the comics right now, I really don't think they're hinting at Suki and Zuko being a romantic relationship. I just take it as kind of quite strong development of their friendship, and I think it's something we've needed, absolutely, and it's one of those ones that makes me kind of think that like I'd like to see more of that setup, like Suki and Toph, like what's their relationship like? I'd like to see that addressed a little bit more. Suki and Katara, like the two kind of oldest girls within the group, I'd like to see that addressed more. Aang and Suki, Suki is definitely a part of Team Avatar for sure. It's just the way she's always been kind of introduced. It's her main connection to the group is through Sokka, and we don't overly know what her relationship is like with the other characters, just by virtue of the fact that she hasn't interacted with them all that much. Like, we have memorable scenes, of course, like the whole Toph kissing Suki on the cheek thinking that it was Sokka moment, and Suki like showing how much she kind of cares about Aang's feelings by like looking after Appa and really knowing how he feels in certain situations. But a lot of the cases like Suki's Zuko, we didn't get a great idea what their relationship was like, but that's what the comics are doing. So yeah, basically just going to end the discussion video there. In the comments, let me know what your thoughts are. This is definitely one where it's all about interpretation of scenes. I've given you my interpretation and analysis in this video. I want to know yours. Do you really believe that this is a relationship they're going for? Have I misinterpreted scenes? Or what? What do you think of the Zuko-Suki potential relationship setup in the comics? But I'll just end by saying, you can follow me on social media on Twitter and Tumblr. Links are in the description below. I'm Airspeed Prime, same username as on YouTube on both of those websites. And then you can support my channel so I can make more videos, better videos on Patreon. Link is in the description. And then if you want to just do a one-off donation, there's also a PayPal donation link in the description below also. And I'll just finish up, last but not least, by thanking my first Patreon, who is Rich Coakley, who some of you may know as one of the 3 original members of the Avatar Online podcast crew. After myself and Callum, Rich was the first person to come on board, so it's great to have him as my first Patreon, so thank you so much for that. So yeah, that's been the video. Thanks for watching, and bye.